Long Beach, 1964. The auditorium was full of people who knew exactly what they were looking at. 2,000 martial artists, black belts, instructors, competitors who had spent decades inside their disciplines. They didn't come to be impressed easily. They came because this event meant something in their world, and Ed Parker had built it carefully enough that it deserved that meaning. Nobody had circled one name on the program. He was 23, unknown outside a small circle in Seattle and Oakland, no American titles, no tournament record that meant anything to this room. Ed Parker had extended the invitation quietly, not as a headline, not as a promise, just as a vouching. A quiet signal from a man whose judgment the community respected. Watch this one. The men in the front rows had 30 years between them and the floor. They carried their authority naturally, the way people do when they've stopped questioning it. Then this young man walked out. He was lean, still, not performing confidence, just present in a way that was easy to underestimate until it wasn't. The room paid loose attention at first. That was about to change. A volunteer stepped forward, stood close, impossibly close, the kind of distance that seemed to eliminate the possibility of power entirely. 1 inch of space between his fist and a man's chest. The sound when it landed wasn't loud, but the man flew backward into the chair waiting behind him, and the front rows went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with politeness. Some of those men had been training since before Lee was born. Ed Parker didn't do things carelessly. By 1964, he had built the International Karate Championships into something that didn't exist before him. A legitimate stage for American martial arts at a time when the community was still figuring out what that meant. The people who came weren't casual. They were practitioners with real lineages, instructors who ran serious schools, competitors whose records meant something inside a world that measured carefully. Parker had credibility because he'd constructed it deliberately. He trained under Chow in Hawaii. He built his own system, Kenpal, and refined it across years of teaching and testing. He understood technique at the level where performance and reality separate, and he protected the event's reputation by controlling who stood in front of his audience. So the invitation to Bruce Lee carried weight precisely because Parker's invitations always carried weight. They had crossed paths a couple of years earlier. What Parker saw wasn't showmanship. It was something harder to name. A completeness. A young man who had thought about fighting the way serious people think about serious things, with every angle already somewhere in the body before the mind finished processing it. Parker wasn't easily moved. He was moved enough. But private certainty and public vouching are different risks entirely. Lee got a slot. Not a headline, a slot. His name on a program filled with established practitioners whose reputations preceded them into the room. He was 23, Chinese, running a small school in Seattle called the Jun Fan Gung Fu Institute. He had students who believed in him completely, and a growing circle in the Bay Area who had seen enough to stop asking questions. None of that traveled with him to Long Beach. In that auditorium, he arrived without context. Wing Chun was his foundation. The Southern Chinese system he had trained under Ip Man in Hong Kong from his early teens. Close range, economical, built around centerline theory and sensitivity rather than the large movements that generated visible power. But by 1964, Lee had already moved beyond strict Wing Chun. Western boxing had shaped his footwork. Fencing had refined how he thought about economy of attack. He had been absorbing and testing and questioning continuously, building something that didn't have a clean name yet. The men in that room didn't know any of this. What they saw was a lean young man of average height with no visible mass, no tournament credentials, no reputation that arrived before him. He didn't carry himself with the practiced gravity of someone managing a known quantity. He wasn't performing ease. He was simply present, still in a way that was easy to read as unremarkable if you weren't paying close attention. Most weren't. Not yet. Parker had done what he could do, extended the invitation, provided the stage, staked his quiet credibility on the outcome. The rest belonged to the afternoon. What Lee was about to demonstrate didn't fit the program's existing grammar. The other demonstrations would show systems, vocabulary, refinement, years of tradition made visible through form and technique. These were things the audience could evaluate because the criteria existed in advance. Lee had decided to show something else, something that would establish its own criteria at the same moment it was being judged. That's the kind of exposure that unmakes people. He waited his turn with the same stillness he carried into everything, not detachment, but concentration that had learned to look like calm. The room moved through its rhythm around him. Nobody had adjusted their expectations yet. That was about to become impossible. You have to understand what that audience was. Not fans, not people who had read about martial arts in a magazine and come to watch something exotic. These were practitioners, people with calluses in specific places, who knew the difference between a technique that was trained and a technique that was performed. They could read preparation in the way a man stood before he moved. That kind of audience is the hardest kind. A general crowd is impressed by speed and confidence in sound. These people were impressed by almost nothing because they had context for everything. When someone executed a clean form, they were already measuring it against forms they had seen, against forms they had thrown 10,000 times in their own bodies. Appreciation existed, but it moved through a finer screen. The 1964 championships had drawn competitors and instructors from across the country. Karate was the dominant language. Japanese and Okinawan traditions that had taken root in America through servicemen who trained overseas and brought it home. Korean systems were present. Some judo, practitioners from disciplines that didn't have clean American names yet. What they shared was a framework, not identical philosophies. Rival systems have genuine disagreements, but a shared grammar of what martial arts looked like when done correctly. Certain principles moved across traditions. Power generated from the hips. Distance management. The relationship between speed and structure. Even practitioners from competing lineages could watch each other and recognize quality because they were reading from overlapping alphabets. Bruce Lee was about to demonstrate something written in a different language entirely. The men in the front rows had between them more collective training than Lee had years alive. They carried this not arrogantly. Most serious practitioners aren't arrogant in the loud way. There's something quieter and harder to move, but with the settled confidence of people whose framework had been tested repeatedly and had held. They had seen impressive things. They had produced impressive things. They knew what the outer range of human physical capability looked like inside their understanding of it. That settled confidence has a specific texture. It makes a room feel solid. What it also does, sometimes, is make a room slightly slow to register something arriving from outside its expectations. The demonstrations before Lee had been good, genuinely good, clean technique for men who had earned their standing, and the audience responded with the measured appreciation of people who recognize craft. Not wild enthusiasm, something more valuable than that. The acknowledgement of people who know what they're looking at. That was the level. That was what Lee was following. There is a particular difficulty in following excellence with something the room has no category for yet. Excellence they can measure. Excellence confirms the framework, validates the shared grammar, sends everyone home with their understanding of the world intact and slightly reinforced. What Lee had prepared didn't confirm anything. It arrived from outside the grammar entirely, and it would ask the room, without asking, without announcing, just by happening, to consider whether the map they had been using might be missing a territory. Some rooms resist that instinctively. The framework is also an identity, and identities protect themselves. But there were men in those front rows who had been training long enough to know something important, that the edge of your knowledge is not a threat. It's the only place where the knowledge actually grows. Those men had gotten there by following evidence, not protecting assumptions. They were leaning forward slightly before they realized they were leaning forward. The room didn't know what was coming, but something in the air had shifted. The specific quality of attention that changes when a crowd moves from watching to actually seeing. Lee stood at the edge of the floor, waiting, present, giving nothing away. The minutes before matter more than people remember, not because anything dramatic happened, because nothing did. And that itself was information, if you were paying attention. The demonstrations moved through their sequence. Each practitioner took the floor, worked through what they had prepared, received their response, stepped back. The rhythm of the event had established itself. People knew when to lean forward and when to settle. The afternoon had found its tempo. Lee waited at the edge of that tempo. He watched the preceding demonstrations the way he watched everything, completely, without obvious intensity. People who knew him well described this quality often, the ability to observe fully while appearing simply to be standing there. His eyes moved. His body didn't. It was the stillness of someone cataloging, not resting. He wasn't warming up visibly. This was noticed afterward, in the conversations where people tried to reconstruct the afternoon. Most practitioners have a pre-demonstration ritual, stretching, shadow movement, some physical preparation that externalizes itself and signals to the room, I am transitioning now. It's partly functional and partly communicative, a way of arriving publicly. Lee didn't signal, he was waiting, and then he wasn't waiting anymore. What he had prepared was not a form, not a kata or sequence designed to display the aesthetic logic of a system. Those demonstrations had genuine value. They showed vocabulary, showed refinement, showed a practitioner in conversation with their tradition. The audience understood and respected that language completely. Lee had decided to show something else. The choice was its own kind of statement, though he didn't frame it that way. He wasn't interested in demonstrating mastery of a tradition. He was interested in demonstrating what he had concluded about fighting, which was a more direct thing, and in that room, a more exposed thing. You can shelter inside a form. The form provides structure and shared criteria. When you perform it badly, the audience knows. When you perform it well, they know that too, and the standard exists before you begin. There is safety in that, even for the very good. What Lee was about to show had no pre-existing standard in that room. He would be establishing the criteria at the same moment he was being evaluated by them. That particular exposure unmakes people. It produces over-explanation before anything happens, or compensatory aggression, or a retreat into credentials. Let me tell you what I've done before you watch me do this. He said very little. Accounts vary in their details the way witnessed moments always do when memory tries to hold something it wasn't prepared to hold. But they converge on this. He was economical with words in a way that wasn't shyness or nerves. He described what he was going to do in the plainest terms available. No anticipation building, no expectation management. Just describing. He would need a volunteer. Someone willing to stand close, very close. A chair would be placed behind the volunteer. The volunteer came forward. The chair was positioned. The distance established. Or rather, the near absence of distance. His fist and the volunteer's chest separated by almost nothing. 1 inch, maybe less from certain angles in the room. From the outside, it looked like the setup for something technical. Something that would require explanation. A sensitivity demonstration, maybe. The kind of subtle thing that needed context to land properly. The room was watching with the loose attention of people who haven't yet been given a reason to watch tightly. Lee settled into position. That looseness had maybe 3 seconds left. The setup looked wrong. That was the immediate reaction. Not skepticism, but visual confusion. Every trained person in that room understood distance. Distance is where power lives. You need space to build force. Hip rotation, weight transfer, the kinetic chain developing from ground up through the body and out. That's not philosophy. That's what years of training had written into their muscles. What Lee was presenting eliminated the premise entirely. His fist was already there, the volunteer standing still, the chair placed behind him with a quiet practicality that hadn't fully registered yet as significant. From the seats it looked like the beginning of something subtle, something that would need explaining after. It didn't need explaining after. What happened was fast in a specific way, not blurring speed, not motion that defeats the eye, but the speed of something arriving before the brain finishes predicting it. A compression, a sharpening of attention across the room triggered by a sound and a movement so compact they occupied nearly the same instant. The sound was wrong too. Power has a sound every person in that room knew intimately. The crack of a clean reverse punch. The thud of a technique finding its mark. These sounds lived in their bodies as confirmation signals. That was real. That counted. This was different, shorter, more interior, less about force traveling and more about something transferring, energy moving from one place into another, with a directness that bypassed the usual physical storytelling of a powerful strike. The volunteer moved, not stumbled, not stepped back. Moved, off his feet, backward. No recovery arc, no moment of catching himself. The chair was there because the chair needed to be there. He landed in it clean. Lee's starting position hadn't changed. 1 inch. Still 1 inch. That was what the room was processing. Not the result, which was visible and finished and undeniable. What the room was processing was the absence of mechanism, no wind-up to track backward from, no visible weight shift preceding the strike. The trained men in the front rows were doing what serious practitioners do when something doesn't parse, running it backward, looking for the moment where it made sense. Some couldn't locate that moment. The silence came before the applause, and it lasted long enough to be its own response. Not confusion exactly. Not disappointment. The specific quiet of people whose framework has just met something it doesn't fully accommodate, and who are honest enough to know the difference between a trick and a thing that actually happened. That honesty was visible on certain faces in the front rows. The slight stillness of men who have stopped performing their reaction because something genuine has replaced it. Then the applause arrived. But the applause wasn't the moment. The moment was the silence before it. Those few seconds where 2,000 people who knew how to evaluate martial technique sat with something they couldn't entirely explain. Lee stood in that silence exactly as he had stood before the demonstration. Quiet, present, not filling the space with explanation or performance. The volunteer was helped up. The chair moved aside. Across the room, people were already turning to the person beside them. The instinctive human response to witnessing something disorienting, checking another face. Confirming. You saw that too. Every face confirmed it. The event continued. That's the part that gets forgotten. More demonstrations followed. More names called. More practitioners taking the floor. The structure of the afternoon reasserted itself with the momentum of organized events. People watched, applauded at the right moments, behaved like an audience. Underneath that, a different conversation was already running. The men in the front rows were still thinking about 1 inch. This is what happens when something doesn't fit cleanly. It follows you into the next moment, sits at the edge of attention, keeps asking to be examined. Serious practitioners don't dismiss evidence easily. They built everything they know by following it. After the program ended, the conversations began. Not a crowd forming around Lee. Nothing that obvious. Smaller groupings. 2 men near the back talking quietly. An instructor standing slightly apart from his students, watching the space Lee occupied with an expression that wasn't quite readable. People finding reasons to be near without making it a production. Some approached directly. These tended to be practitioners whose training had made them comfortable with not knowing. People who understood that the edge of your knowledge is where learning actually lives. They asked specific questions, wanted to understand the mechanics underneath the result. Lee answered what was asked. He didn't elaborate beyond the question. Others didn't approach. This requires honesty because it was real and human and completely understandable. Some men in that room had built schools, built reputations, built identities around a particular understanding of how martial arts worked. What they witnessed didn't threaten them physically. It did something more complicated. Introduced a variable their framework hadn't accounted for. Not everyone follows the variable. Some leave those moments with a counter-narrative already forming. The chair was staged. There's a mechanical explanation somewhere that preserves the existing map. This isn't weakness. It's a normal response to information arriving faster than clean integration allows. But the front rows had been close enough. Distance settles arguments that words cannot. The men who had watched Lee's body in the moment before the strike, close enough to see what didn't happen, no loading, no telegraph, those men were having a harder time with the counter-narrative. Some of them drove home that evening carrying a question they hadn't arrived with. It didn't announce itself. It just sat there, quietly waiting. He drove back without a trophy, no bracket to win, no title to carry home, no official record that anything had changed. The championships had its legitimate results, its rankings. Lee's name didn't appear in any of them formally. What he carried back couldn't be documented. In the weeks following, the afternoon circulated the way significant things circulated before video existed, through conversation, through the credibility of eyewitnesses, through a community whose members trained together and trusted certain voices. Someone told someone. That person told three more. The story moved with the slight distortion all stories acquire in transit, but its center held because enough serious people had been in the room. Ed Parker knew what he had seen. Their relationship deepened after Long Beach. Parker remained a bridge between worlds, someone who understood both well enough to translate, and who had recognized early that translation was necessary. The vouching had been validated beyond what Parker might have privately expected. The people who had approached Lee after, who asked specific questions and received specific answers, some went home carrying fragments of a different framework. Not conversion. Martial artists with established systems don't abandon them after one afternoon. But the questions Lee had planted were the persistent kind. They show up uninvited while you're running a drill. You've run 10,000 times, and suddenly a premise you've never examined is asking to be examined. That's a slow fire. It doesn't announce itself. Long Beach didn't make Bruce Lee famous. The straight line between that afternoon and everything that followed bends considerably. Through years of work, Hollywood resistance, the particular frustration of someone who understood exactly what he had and kept searching for the right stage to show it at scale. But what Long Beach gave him practically was network. The American martial arts community was small in 1964, and that auditorium had concentrated much of it in one building. Their testimony opened doors that might have taken longer to find. What those people remembered, though, wasn't the connections or the career that followed. They remembered the silence, those few seconds between the sound of the strike and the arrival of the applause, when the room was just sitting with something it hadn't been prepared for, honest in its confusion before the performance of reaction took over. The volunteer had gotten up. The demonstration was over. Some people in that room are still deciding what they saw.